The announcement landed without warning, rippling through Hollywood faster than anyone expected, because it came not from a studio press office or a trade leak, but directly from Steven Spielberg himself. 1 minute, the industry was still processing the quiet after Rob Reiner's funeral. The next, Spielberg's words reframed the grief into something else entirely. Not closure, not celebration, but continuation that he did not begin by listing credentials or accolades. He spoke instead about memory, about how some people shape your life so completely that even after they're gone, you keep turning to speak to them out of habit. He admitted that he had done exactly that more than once since Rob's passing, only to remember mid-thought that the conversation would have to happen another way now. The tribute film, Spielberg explained, would not be a biopic. It would not chart Rob's life chronologically or attempt to recreate famous moments. That approach felt wrong to him, too neat, too final. Instead, the film would focus on influence, on the quiet, unseen ways Rob changed people, conversations, and choices over decades. Spielberg said Rob believed stories mattered most when they reflected who we are becoming, not just who we were. That framing immediately set the tone. This was not a victory lap. It was not nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It was an acknowledgement that Rob Reiner's impact extended far beyond the frames of the films he directed or the characters he played. It lived in people, in how they argued, listened, forgave, and showed up. Then came a moment that stunned everyone. Spielberg confirmed the cast. Not teased, not hinted, confirmed. Names that usually arrive through weeks of controlled leaks were spoken plainly, as if secrecy no longer mattered. The room where the announcement was made reportedly fell silent, not out of shock alone, but out of recognition. These are not random choices. They were people Rob had touched personally. Spielberg made it clear that each actor had agreed immediately. No negociations, no hositación. Some have been dealing privately with Rob's death and saw the project as a way to process what words alone could not. Others admitted they had been waiting for a way to honor him that felt honest rather than ceremonial. This film, Spielberg said, gave them that chance that he described the structure carefully. The film would unfold through intersecting stories, each one inspired by real moments, but not bound to strict fact. Spielberg emphasized that truth does not always live in accuracy. Sometimes it lives in emotional recognition. Rob understood that better than anyone. He taught people to trust the feeling beneath the detail that A.S. Spielberg spoke. It became clear that the project was as much personal as professional. He recalled moments when Rob challenged him, disagreed with him, and pushed him to explain himself rather than rely on instinct. Those conversations were not always comfortable, but they were always honest. Spielberg said Rob never wanted agreement. He wanted clarity that philosophy would guide the film. No single protagonist, no central hero. Instead, a mosaic of perspectives. A director wrestling with doubt, an actor confronting regret, a writer reconsidering an old argument. Each thread connected not by plot, but by the invisible presence of someone who once changed the direction of a life with a single conversation. Spielberg acknowledged the risk. Tribute films often collapse under the weight of reverence. They become polite, safe, forgettable. He refused to let that happen. Rob hated safety. He respected intention, not caution. The film would reflect that spirit, even if it made some viewers uncomfortable. The announcement spread instantly. Social feeds filled with disbelief, then emotion. Industry veterans spoke openly about how rare it was to see a tribute conceived this quickly, this boldly, without studio hesitation. That urgency mattered. Spielberg said waiting would have diluted the truth. Grief changes with time. He wanted to capture it while it was still raw, unresolved, and real. What surprised many was Spielberg's closing thought. He said the film was not about loss. It was about responsibility. Responsibility to carry forward the lessons Rob left behind. Responsibility to keep asking hard questions. Responsibility to show up, that he ended simply. Rob spent his life reminding us that stories connect us when we're brave enough to tell them honestly. This is our turn. Within hours of Spielberg's announcement, the industry reaction shifted from surprise to something deeper and more emotional. This was not the usual cycle of excitement followed by analysis. It felt personal. People were not debating box office prospects or awards potential. They were talking about Rob, about moments they had never shared publicly, about conversations that had changed them in ways they hadn't fully understood until now. Several cast members, though bound by discretion, quietly confirmed that the film had already begun taking shape in conversations long before the public announcement, not in scripts or meetings, but in shared grief. Some had called Spielberg independently in the days after Rob's death, unsure what they were even asking for. Others had reached out to each other, searching for language to describe what they were feeling. Spielberg's film became the place where those unfinished thoughts could land. What made the cast list so striking was not just the caliber of the names, but the logic behind them. These were not actors chosen to imitate Rob or portray him directly. In fact, Rob Reiner would not appear on screen as a character at all. Spielberg insisted on that. Rob doesn't need to be played, he said. He needs to be felt. Each actor represented a facet of Rob's influence. Not his image point one actor was said to embody Rob's belief in confrontation as a form of respect. Another explored his insistence that humor and pain are not opposites, but partners. Another reflected the cost of walking away from a relationship too early. None of these roles were explained publicly, but those close to the project said they were drawn directly from real conversations Rob had over the years, conversations that never made headlines but shaped careers and lives. The structure of the film itself became a topic of intense interest. Spielberg described it as a sequence of emotional handoffs. One story would not resolve before another began. Threads would overlap, interrupt, and sometimes contradict each other. That was intentional. Rob believed truth often lives in tension, not resolution. The film would honor that by refusing to tidy up emotional loose ends. Behind the scenes, Spielberg was said to be unusually open with the cast. He did not arrive with rigid interpretations. Instead, he asked questions. What did Rob mean to you? What did he challenge you? What did he disappoint you? What did he change you? Those answers became part of the film's DNA. The cast was not performing tribute. They were participating in it. Industry veterans immediately recognized how unusual this was. Tribute films often freeze their subject in time, polishing rough edges into mythology. Spielberg was doing the opposite. He was leaning into complexity, allowing contradiction, trusting the audience to sit with discomfort. That trust alone signaled how deeply Rob's influence had shaped Spielberg's own evolution as a storyteller. Point one, particularly striking detail, emerged from early discussions. The film would include moments of absence, characters waiting for phone calls that never come, conversations imagined but never had, reconciliations that arrived too late. These were not narrative devices. They were acknowledgments. Spielberg said Rob understood absence as much as presence, and that understanding had shaped many of his most honest conversations. As news spread, younger filmmakers reacted differently than expected. Instead of seeing the project as a monument to the past, they saw it as a challenge. Rob had mentored quietly, without branding himself as a mentor. Many realized only now how much his philosophy had seeped into their own thinking. The film felt less like a goodbye and more like a responsibility handed forward. What also stood out was how quickly the cast aligned around shared tone. There was no appetite for sentimentality, no swelling music cues to force tears. Spielberg reportedly reminded everyone that Rob trusted audiences. He never manipulated emotion. He created space for it. The film would do the same. Privately, some actors admitted they were nervous. Playing roles rooted in real, emotional history carries risk. It requires vulnerability that cannot be faked. Spielberg acknowledged that risk openly. He told them discomfort was a sign they were doing it right. Rob believed growth begins where certainty ends. The announcement also shifted how people spoke about Rob's death. The narrative moved away from finality and toward continuity, not in a denial of loss, but in recognition of influence. Rob's voice would not be recreated. It would be echoed through choices, conflicts, and moments of courage on screen that be why the end of the day, one thing was clear. This was not a project driven by legacy management. It was driven by urgency, by the understanding that some stories need to be told while they still ache. Spielberg had chosen to act not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. One producer close to the film said quietly, "This isn't about honoring Rob Reiner. It's about answering him." As details continued to emerge, it became clear that Spielberg's tribute was evolving into something far more intimate than a standard memorial project. Those involved described early table readings that felt less like rehearsals and more like conversations people had been postponing for years. There were pauses that lingered, lines that were rewritten not for clarity, but for honesty. Moments where actors stopped speaking altogether because the weight of what they were exploring could not be rushed. Spielberg encouraged that pace. He reminded everyone that Rob never hurried difficult truths. He let them arrive when they were ready. That philosophy guided the process. Scenes were allowed to breathe. Silence was treated as dialogue. In one early sequence, an actor reportedly sits alone in a room for nearly a full minute, doing nothing except listening to a voicemail he never deletes. Spielberg insisted the moment stay exactly as it was. Rob would have left it, he said. The cast began to share how personal the material felt. Several admitted they were not acting so much as responding. Lines mirrored conversations they had actually had with Rob, sometimes word for word, other times only in spirit. One actor said it felt as if Rob had written the scene years ago, knowing it would only make sense later. That sense of delayed understanding became a recurring theme throughout the film. Spielberg also made a surprising choice regarding structure. There would be no clear beginning or ending. The film would open in the middle of an unresolved argument and close on a moment of choice rather than resolution. He explained that Rob distrusted need arcs. Life, Rob believed, is lived in fragments that only feel coherent when we look back. The film would honor that by resisting traditional emotional closure, AS production quietly moved forward. The atmosphere on set was described as unusually restrained. No grand speeches, no celebratory energy. Instead, there was focus, attention, a shared understanding that this work required care rather than enthusiasm. Spielberg himself was said to be quieter than usual, listening more, directing less, allowing actors to find their way into scenes without being pushed. Crew members noticed it too. Lighting was adjusted to feel natural rather than dramatic. Music was used sparingly, often fading out before it could cue emotion. Everything about the production seemed designed to remove artifice. Spielberg wanted the audience to feel like they were overhearing something real, not watching something constructed. One of the most discussed elements internally was how the film handled disagreement. Characters argue. They misinterpret each other. They leave conversations unfinished. There's no moral sorting of who is right or wrong. Spielberg said that was essential. Rob believed disagreement was a sign of respect when it was honest. The film would not soften that belief. As word spread, people who had known Rob began reaching out to Spielberg with stories, not to be included, but to be acknowledged. Spielberg listened to many of them. He did not promise representation. He promised attention. He explained that the film could not contain everyone, but it would carry the essence of Rob's way of being with people. That distinction mattered. This was not about documentation. It was about transmission, transmitting values, transmitting courage, transmitting the idea that showing up, even imperfectly, matters. Spielberg understood that tribute, in Rob's eyes, meant continuation, not commemoration. The cast list, once confirmed, stopped being the headline. What mattered now was how those people were working together. Rivalries dissolved. Hierarchies flattened. On this set, everyone was simply responding to something they had lost and were trying to carry forward. That shared purpose changed the dynamic entirely. One actor described a moment where a scene had to be reset because no one could speak afterward. Not because it was emotional in a performative way, but because it felt like something had been acknowledged rather than acted. Spielberg waited. He did not break the silence. He trusted it. That trust, many said, felt like the clearest echo of Rob's influence. As filming progressed, The urgency that had sparked the project remained, but it was tempered by patience. Spielberg resisted pressure to announce timelines or release dates. He said the film would be finished when it told the truth it was meant to tell. Rushing would betray its purpose. Those closest to the project sensed that something rare was happening. Not a film chasing relevance, but a group of people answering a call left behind by someone who had shaped how they listened, argued, and cared. The tribute was not loud. It was deliberate. Why the end of this phase? Everyone involved understood that the film would not offer comfort in the traditional sense. It would not reassure audiences that everything resolves. Instead, it would invite them to sit with complexity, with absence, with the ongoing responsibility of connection. In that way, Spielberg's tribute was becoming exactly what Rob Reiner would have wanted. Not a monument, a conversation. As production advanced, the weight of what Spielberg was attempting became clearer not only to the cast, but to those watching from the edges of the industry. This was not simply a film being made. It was a collective reckoning with influence, with mentorship, and with the unseen threads that connect people long after collaboration ends. Rob Reiner's presence hovered over the set, not as nostalgia, but as a standard everyone felt compelled to meet. Several actors admitted privately that they began reconsidering old relationships because of the work. Scenes forced them to confront moments where they had chosen silence over honesty, distance over dialogue. Those realizations did not always feel comfortable, but they felt necessary. Spielberg encouraged those reactions, reminding them that Rob believed discomfort was often the first sign that truth was close. The film's writing process evolved in tandem with rehearsals. Dialogue was not locked early. Instead, lines shifted as actors brought lived experience into the room. Spielberg welcomed those changes, saying Rob always trusted people to speak from where they actually were, not from where the script said they should be. That flexibility created scenes that felt alive rather than rehearsed. One sequence that became central to the film involved two characters sitting in a car, saying almost nothing for several minutes. Early drafts included a conversation explaining their history. Spielberg cut it entirely. He believed Rob would have trusted the audience to feel the tension without explanation. The silence, he said, carried more honesty than exposition ever could. Crew members noted how often Spielberg paused takes to ask a single question. Does this feel true? Not is it good? Not is it working? True. That question guided every decision. If the answer was uncertain, the scene was revisited. Rob's influence was evident in that refusal to settle for something that merely functioned. Word of the film spread beyond Hollywood. Reactions from audiences who had grown up with Rob's work began to surface. Many expressed surprise at the direction Spielberg had taken. They expected nostalgia. Instead, they were being offered reflection. Spielberg anticipated that reaction and welcomed it. Rob, he said, never wanted to be remembered as safe. The cast grew closer through the process, bonded not by celebration, but by vulnerability. There were no victory laps on set. Instead, there were long conversations after filming days ended. Conversations about fear, regret, gratitude, and the cost of creative lives. Those conversations, several actors said, felt like the real work of the film. One particularly powerful moment occurred during a rehearsal when an actor struggled to deliver a line about forgiveness. Spielberg stopped the scene and asked the actor to speak about why it felt difficult. The discussion that followed reshaped the scene entirely. The line remained, but it was spoken differently, quieter, more tentative. That change transformed the moment from performance into recognition. Spielberg made it clear that the film would not instruct audiences how to feel. There would be no cues telling viewers when to cry or when to feel uplifted. He trusted Rob's belief that audiences are capable of emotional honesty if given space. The film would offer that space and nothing more. As production neared its final stages, the urgency that had driven the announcement softened into resolve. There was no rush now. The film had found its rhythm. It moved deliberately, refusing to be pulled into expectation. Spielberg rejected early test screenings, saying the film was not meant to be adjusted based on comfort levels. It was meant to stand as it was. Those closest to Spielberg said the project changed him as well. He listened more on set. He intervened less. He allowed moments to unfold without steering them toward clarity. Rob's influence had not only inspired the tribute, it had reshaped Spielberg's process in real time. The industry began to understand that this film would not be easily categorized. It would not fit neatly into awards conversations or marketing campaigns. That uncertainty was intentional. Rob had taught people to value meaning over classification. Spielberg honored that by letting the film exist on its own terms, as the final scenes were filmed, there was no applause, no speeches, just a quiet acknowledgement that something significant had been carried forward. Spielberg gathered the cast and crew and said only this: Rob believed that what we do matters most when it helps people stay connected. If this film does that, even for one person, then we've done our job. In that moment, the tribute felt complete, even though the film itself was not yet finished. Completion, everyone realized, did not mean closure. It meant alignment. Alignment with Rob's values. Alignment with truth. Alignment with the responsibility he had left behind. As word of the project continued to spread, it became clear that Spielberg's announcement had not merely revealed a film. It had reopened a conversation Rob Reiner spent his life insisting was worth having. A conversation about presence, courage, and the cost of silence. And this time, the industry was listening. As post-production quietly began, the emotional weight of the project did not lift. If anything, it deepened. Editing sessions were described as unexpectedly difficult, not because of technical challenges, but because each cut required judgment about what truth to preserve and what to let go. Spielberg approached the edit not as a craftsman chasing perfection, but as a listener trying not to interrupt something fragile. He often sat through scenes without speaking, replaying them again and again, watching faces rather than performances. He paid attention to hesitation, to breaths taken before lines, to moments when actors looked away instead of directly at one another. Those details mattered. Rob had always said that meaning hides in what people almost say. Spielberg built the film around those almost moments. Editors noticed that Spielberg resisted trimming silence, even when pacing convention suggested it. He argued that silence was part of the language of the film. Removing it would be like cutting out punctuation. Some scenes ended earlier than expected. Others lingered longer than felt comfortable. That discomfort was intentional. Rob believed discomfort invited honesty. The edit honored that belief. Music became another careful decision. Spielberg chose not to commission a sweeping score. Instead, he worked with minimal themes that surfaced briefly, then disappeared. Often, scenes played without music entirely. Spielberg said Rob distrusted emotional coercion. He wanted viewers to arrive at feeling on their own, without being guided by sound. Rough cuts circulated privately. Reactions were intense but subdued. People did not leave screenings energized. They left quiet, thoughtful. Some admitted they needed time before speaking. That response reassured Spielberg. The film was doing what Rob would have wanted. It was creating space rather than filling it. Several early viewers described the experience as unsettling in a productive way. They expected to learn more about Rob Reiner. Instead, they learned more about themselves. The film did not offer facts. It offered mirrors. That reaction spread quickly among those invited to early viewings, though details remained tightly held. The confirmed cast, now fully immersed in the project, began speaking carefully about their involvement. They avoided superlatives. They spoke instead about responsibility. One actor said participating in the film felt like being trusted with something fragile. Another said it forced him to reconsider how he handles unresolved relationships in his own life. Spielberg remained largely absent from public discussion during this phase. He declined interviews. He postponed festival conversations. He said the film would speak when it was ready. That restraint was noted across the industry. It mirrored Rob's own preference for letting work breathe before explaining it. Behind the scenes, there were moments of doubt. Some worried audiences might resist a tribute that refused comfort. Others questioned whether such an introspective film could reach beyond industry circles. Spielberg acknowledged those concerns without conceding to them. Rob had never shaped his work around fear of misunderstanding. He trusted sincerity over consensus. AS release discussions began quietly. Spielberg made one condition clear. The film would premiere without spectacle. No red carpet, no speeches, no framing it as an event. He wanted the first audience to encounter it without noise. The same way Rob believed meaningful conversations should begin. That decision surprised studios, but no one pushed back. The project carried too much integrity to be negotiated that way. People sensed that interfering would diminish what had been built. The tribute demanded respect, not promotion. Meanwhile, word continued to circulate about the cast and the nature of the film. Expectations shifted. People stopped asking what the movie was about and began asking what it felt like. Those who had seen it struggled to answer. They said it felt like being invited into a private conversation and realizing you were meant to listen, not respond. As the final cut approached, Spielberg watched the film alone for the first time. He later admitted it was the hardest viewing of his career, not because of grief, but because of recognition. He saw Rob everywhere, not on screen, but in the choices made, in what was left unsaid, in the patience of the storytelling. When a cut ended, Spielberg did not adjust anything. He did not take notes. He simply sat. That, those close to him said, was how they knew the film was finished. Not because it was flawless, but because it was honest. Rob Reiner's tribute was no longer a project. It was a continuation, a responsibility carried forward through restraint, courage, and attention. Spielberg had not tried to summarize Rob's life. He had tried to honor how Rob lived it. And in doing so, he had created something that did not ask to be praised. It asked to be felt. As the film's existence became impossible to ignore, conversations outside the industry began to mirror the ones unfolding inside it. People who had never met Rob Reiner found themselves responding to the themes his life had inspired. Viewers spoke less about cinema and more about relationships, about words left unsaid, about the strange weight of realizing that time does not pause for clarity. Spielberg noticed this shift and felt quietly affirmed. Rob had always believed stories were tools, not trophies. Their purpose was to move people toward reflection, not admiration. The fact that the film was already doing that before its release told Spielberg he had stayed true to that principle. One unexpected outcome was how the project reframed Rob's public image. For decades, he had been known as a confident voice, an articulate presence, someone unafraid to speak his mind. The film revealed something else beneath that confidence, a willingness to sit in uncertainty, to allow disagreement without rushing to dominance. That dimension surprised even those who thought they knew him well. Several journalists who were briefed privately remarked that the film resisted the temptation to define Rob through his opinions. Instead, it focused on how he listened, how he argued, how he stayed in conversations that others might exit to protect comfort. That focus shifted the narrative from personality to practice, from what Rob believed to how he behaved. As anticipation built, Spielberg held firm to his decision not to market the film traditionally. He refused trailers that explained too much. He declined taglines that summarized themes. He wanted viewers to encounter the film without armor. Rob had always said that defensiveness blocks understanding. Spielberg honored that by refusing to give audiences a script for how to feel. The cast supported this approach wholeheartedly. Many turned down interview opportunities that sought sound bites rather than substance. When they did speak, they spoke carefully. They avoided sensational language. They spoke instead about gratitude, discomfort, and growth. Those interviews, sparse as they were, reinforced the sense that this project existed outside usual cycles. Internally, there were discussions about legacy. Not Rob's, but everyone else's. Working on the film had forced people to consider what they would leave behind if conversations ended prematurely. That awareness lingered. It changed how some people spoke to collaborators. It softened long-held resentments. It encouraged risk in honesty rather than in performance. Spielberg reflected on his own relationship with Rob more openly during this phase. He acknowledged moments where he had resisted Rob's challenges, choosing ease over engagement. He admitted that the film had forced him to revisit those moments without defensiveness. That willingness to self-interrogate set the tone for everyone involved. As the release date approached, the absence of spectacle became its own statement. In a culture accustomed to constant noise, the film's quiet arrival felt almost radical. People were unsure how to approach it. That uncertainty mirrored the film's content. It asked viewers to sit without immediate orientation. The first public screening was held without announcement. Invitations were personal. Phones were checked at the door. There was no introduction beyond a brief acknowledgement that the film would speak for itself. Spielberg did not appear. Neither did most of the cast. The focus was entirely on the work. Reactions afterward were restrained. There was applause, but it was brief. People did not rush to discuss. Many left silently. Some stayed seated long after the credits ended. That response echoed what Spielberg had hoped for. Rob had always believed that the most meaningful reactions are quiet ones in the days that followed. Conversations emerged slowly. Viewers spoke about scenes that felt uncomfortably familiar, about characters who reminded them of themselves, about moments that stayed with them longer than expected. The absence of a central protagonist made those identifications easier. Everyone found something different reflected back at them. Critics struggled to categorize the film. Some called it a meditation. Others called it a reckoning. Spielberg resisted labels. He said Rob would have laughed at the need to define it so quickly, meaning Rob believed unfolds over time. It does not announce itself. As wider audiences prepared to encounter the film, Spielberg shared one final thought with those close to him. He said the tribute had taught him something essential. That honoring someone does not mean preserving them unchanged. It means allowing their influence to challenge you, to reshape you, to continue working on you long after they're gone. That, in the end, was the film's quiet power. It did not ask viewers to remember Rob Reiner. It asked them to carry him forward, not as an icon, but as a set of questions that refused to disappear. And in that refusal, Rob's voice remained present, not because it was recreated, but because it was answered as the film slowly entered broader circulation. Something unusual happened. Instead of dominating conversation for a brief, intense moment and then fading, it lingered. People did not rush to summarize it. They returned to it. They referenced it in unrelated conversations. They found themselves thinking about scenes days later, often without being able to pinpoint exactly why. Spielberg recognized this pattern immediately. It mirrored the way Rob Reiner himself stayed with people. Rob was never someone you fully processed in a single encounter. His influence accumulated. It resurfaced later, often at inconvenient moments, when you were forced to reconsider something you thought you had already settled. The film had inherited that quality. Audience reactions revealed a striking divide, not between those who liked the film and those who didn't, but between those who expected answers and those who were willing to sit with questions. Some viewers initially felt unsettled by the lack of resolution. Others felt unexpectedly relieved. They described the experience as permission to stop pretending that every relationship finds closure. That response reached Spielberg through quiet channels. Letters, emails, conversations relayed by mutual friends. People spoke about calling estranged siblings, about finally addressing old disagreements, about choosing to listen instead of retreat. Spielberg never claimed credit for those changes. He attributed them to Rob's way of being, now amplified through shared reflection. The cast also felt the aftereffects. Several actors admitted that once the film was released, they could no longer distance themselves from the themes they had explored. The work had changed their expectations of themselves. One actor said he now felt uncomfortable leaving conversations unresolved. Another said he had become more deliberate about showing up, even when he wasn't sure he was welcome. Spielberg watched these reactions with a mix of gratitude and humility. He had not set out to create impact in that sense. He had set out to be faithful. Rob had always taught him that intention matters more than outcome. If the work was honest, the rest would follow in its own way. What also became apparent was how the film reframed Rob Reiner's legacy for a new generation. Younger viewers, less familiar with his early work, encountered him first through the values embedded in the film. They did not meet him as a director or actor, but as a presence. Someone who believed conversation was worth the discomfort it sometimes brings. Educators began referencing the film in discussions about storytelling and ethics. Not because it offered lessons, but because it modeled a way of engaging with complexity. Rob had always argued that stories should not simplify people. The film embodied that belief by refusing to categorize characters neatly. Spielberg resisted invitations to explain the film's meaning. He declined panels that promised definitive interpretations. He said Rob would have been suspicious of anyone claiming to understand something so fully. Understanding, Rob believed, is always provisional. It grows as we do. As months passed, the film did not fade into nostalgia. It became a point of reference. People invoked it not to reminisce, but to recalibrate, to ask whether they were avoiding conversations that mattered, to question whether silence was serving anyone. One particularly telling moment occurred when Spielberg was asked whether he would ever make another tribute like this. He paused before answering. He said tributes should not be planned. They should be unavoidable. This one had been unavoidable. Rob's influence had demanded a response. The absence of spectacle continued to define the film's presence. There were no victory tours, no awards campaigns framed around legacy. Spielberg said that chasing recognition would undermine the project's purpose. Rob had never measured success by applause. He measured it by engagement. The final impact of the film became clearer not through headlines, but through quieter shifts. People spoke differently. They argued differently. They listened longer. Those changes did not make news, but they mattered more. In the end, Spielberg reflected that the greatest tribute he could offer Rob Reiner was not a film, but a continuation of Rob's values and practice. The film was simply one expression of that continuation. The real work would happen elsewhere, in conversations sparked but not shown on screen. Rob had once said that stories end, but relationships don't. They evolve. They echo. They leave traces. Spielberg's tribute did not close a chapter. It extended one. As the film settled into the cultural landscape, its presence remained quiet but persistent. Like Rob himself, asking questions, inviting honesty, refusing easy answers. That, more than anything, ensured that Rob Reiner was not remembered only for what he made, but for how he taught others to be with one another. As time moved on, the conversations sparked by the film continued to deepen rather than dissipate. What surprised many observers was how rarely people described it using cinematic language. They didn't talk about scenes or performances as much as they talked about moments in their own lives that suddenly felt exposed. The film had become a quiet companion, resurfacing when people least expected it. Spielberg noticed that audiences were not recommending the film enthusiastically in the usual way. Instead of urging others to watch it immediately, they often said something more measured. Watch it when you're ready. That phrase appeared again and again. It reflected an understanding that the film was not entertainment in the traditional sense. It was an encounter. That reaction echoed Rob Reiner's own philosophy about storytelling. Rob never believed stories existed to distract us from ourselves. He believed they existed to bring us back. Spielberg had internalized that belief over decades of friendship, and the film carried it forward with quiet insistence. One of the most discussed elements, ironically, was what the film did not show. There were no reenactments of Rob's most famous professional triumphs. No iconic moments recreata. No attempts to visually summarize his career. At first, some viewers found that absence puzzling. Over time, they understood it as respect. Rob had never wanted his work separated from the people it touched. The film honored that by focusing on influence rather than accomplishment. As the months passed, Spielberg began receiving letters from people far outside the film industry. Teachers, therapists, clergy, parents. They wrote about how the film gave language to things they had struggled to articulate, about how it validated the discomfort of staying present in hard conversations. Spielberg responded to many of those letters personally, often briefly, always sincerely. He felt Rob would have wanted that human exchange more than any accolade. The cast also continued to process their involvement long after filming ended. Several spoke about how the experience changed the way they approached future roles. They became less interested in characters that resolved cleanly and more drawn to those that remained open. They sought stories that trusted audiences rather than instructing them. One actor described realizing, months later, that the film had changed how he grieved. He no longer sought closure. He allowed loss to remain unfinished, integrated rather than resolved. That shift brought unexpected peace. Spielberg recognized that sentiment immediately. Rob had often said grief is not something you get over. It's something you learn to carry differently. The film's influence extended quietly into creative spaces as well. Writers spoke about letting scenes breathe. Directors spoke about trusting silence. Editors spoke about resisting the urge to explain. Rob's sensibility was spreading not as doctrine, but as permission. What became increasingly clear was that the film had achieved something rare. It had honored a life without freezing it. It allowed Rob Reiner to remain dynamic, challenging, unresolved. In doing so, it avoided the trap of turning him into a symbol. He remained a person, full of contradictions, still capable of provoking thought. Spielberg eventually reflected on the timing of the project. He said if it had been made years later, it would have been different, softer, more distant. Grief, he realized, sharpens attention. It strips away the need to perform understanding, making the film, when they did preserve that sharpness, as new audiences continued to encounter the film, the same pattern repeated. Quiet entry, lingering impact, slow integration. There are no viral moments, no quotable lines designed for repetition. The film resisted being broken into fragments. It insisted on being experienced as a whole, or not at all. That insistence mirrored Rob's own approach to relationships. He did not believe in partial engagement. He believed in showing up fully or not at all. The film embodied that ethic by asking viewers for attention rather than applause. In the end, Spielberg understood that the tribute had succeeded not because it captured Rob Reiner, but because it continued him. It allowed his values to move forward, adapting to new contexts, new people, new conversations. That continuation was the greatest honor possible. That Rob's absence remained real, painful, unavoidable. But alongside it now existed something else. A shared language for complexity. A reminder that presence matters even when outcomes are uncertain. A quiet insistence that conversations worth having are rarely comfortable. The film did not replace Rob Reiner. Nothing could, but it ensured that the way he lived, listened, and challenged others did not end with him. It traveled onward, carried by those willing to sit with discomfort and choose engagement anyway. And that, perhaps, was the most faithful tribute imaginable. Not a monument, not a conclusion, but an ongoing conversation that refuses to go silent. As the conversation surrounding the film matured, something subtle but profound became apparent. The tribute had not only preserved Rob Reiner's presence, it had changed how people understood influence itself. Influence, the film suggested, was not about visibility or authority. It was about the courage to remain engaged when withdrawal would be easier. That idea resonated far beyond the boundaries of cinema. Spielberg observed that people rarely spoke about the film in groups. They spoke about it one-on-one, quietly, often hesitantly. It was as if the experience demanded intimacy rather than consensus. That, Spielberg felt, was entirely appropriate. Rob had always believed that meaningful exchanges happened between people, not crowds. What also emerged was a renewed appreciation for patience. The film moved slowly, and in doing so, it trained audiences to slow down with it. In a culture accustomed to immediacy, that deceleration felt almost radical. Viewers reported feeling restless at first, then unexpectedly grounded. The film had asked them to meet it where it was, not where they wanted it to be. This effect mirrored Rob's approach to conflict. He never rushed resolution. He allowed discomfort to linger long enough for honesty to surface. The film did the same. It did not reward impatience. It rewarded attention that as more people encountered the work, discussions about Rob's legacy shifted decisively. They moved away from lists of accomplishments and toward descriptions of impact. People spoke about how Rob made them feel heard, even when he disagreed, how he challenged without dismissing, how he stayed present in conversations others avoided. Those qualities, the film suggested, were not ancillary to his career. They were central to it. Spielberg reflected privately that the tribute had also altered how he thought about endings. The film did not end in a way that felt final. It ended in a way that felt open. That openness, he realized, was the truest reflection of Rob's life. Rob never believed conversations were finished. He believed they paused. The cast continued to feel the ripple effects. Several spoke about being approached by strangers who did not want autographs or photos, but conversation. They wanted to talk about choices they had avoided, about relationships they feared confronting. The actors listened, often without offering advice. They recognized that listening was the lesson they had inherited as months passed. The film settled into something like a reference point. People returned to it not for comfort, but for recalibration. When facing difficult decisions, some found themselves asking what it meant to show up honestly. That question, more than any scene, became the film's lasting contribution. Spielberg acknowledged that he had underestimated the reach of that question. He had made the film for Rob, and for those who loved him. But Rob's values, once articulated, proved transferable. They applied to families, workplaces, friendships. Anywhere people struggled with the tension between safety and truth, the absence of spectacle continued to define the film's identity. It never became a cultural event in the conventional sense. It became something quieter and more durable, a touchstone, a reminder. Spielberg found that deeply fitting. Rob had never sought the spotlight for its own sake. He valued substance over attention. In reflecting on the journey, Spielberg admitted that the film had changed his relationship with his own work. He felt less urgency to explain himself, less need to justify choices. Rob had taught him that clarity emerges from consistency, not defense. The film reinforced that lesson at a moment when it mattered most. As the tribute reached this stage, it no longer felt accurate to call a film about Rob Reiner. It was a film shaped by him. In that distinction lay its power. It did not ask viewers to admire Rob. It asked them to practice what he practiced. That practice was simple but not easy. Stay present. Speak honestly. Listen fully. Accept discomfort as part of connection. Those principles did not age. They did not belong to a single generation or profession. They remained relevant because they addressed something fundamental. As the project continued to live quietly in the world, Spielberg felt a sense of alignment he rarely experienced. He had not tried to define Rob's meaning. He had allowed it to reveal itself through attention and care. That restraint, he believed, was the final gift Rob had given him. The tribute had become what it needed to be. Not an answer, but an invitation. An invitation to engage more deeply, to resist withdrawal, to choose presence over certainty. And in that invitation, Rob Reiner's voice remained unmistakable. Not louder than before, not clearer, but still asking the questions that mattered most. The final measure of the tribute revealed itself not in applause or analysis, but in quiet continuity. Long after discussions faded, long after articles stopped appearing, the film remained present in the background of people's lives. It surfaced unexpectedly, during moments of hesitation or reflection, reminding them that avoidance is also a choice, and that presence carries weight even when outcomes remain uncertain. Spielberg came to understand that this was the truest outcome possible. Rob Reiner had never sought permanence through recognition. He sought it through influence that moved invisibly, reshaping decisions rather than drawing attention to itself. The film had achieved that by refusing to close Rob's story. It left it open, active, still working on those who encountered it. What endured was not a specific image or line, but a sensibility, a way of being in conversation, a willingness to stay engaged. Viewers found themselves pausing before disengaging from difficult exchanges. They listened longer. They spoke more carefully. These changes were subtle, but they mattered. They represented Rob's values carried forward in practice rather than memory. The absence of finality became the tribute's greatest strength. There was no definitive goodbye, no sense that something had been neatly concluded. Instead, there was an understanding that Rob's influence remained unfinished, still unfolding through the people he had challenged, supported, and stayed present with. Spielberg reflected that honoring someone does not mean preserving them intact. It means allowing their influence to continue evolving, even when that evolution is uncomfortable. The film had done exactly that. It trusted audiences to carry something forward without instruction, just as Rob had trusted the people in his life that in the end, the tribute did not ask to be remembered. It asked to be lived. And in that request, Rob Reiner's presence endured, not as a figure of the past, but as a quiet force shaping the present, one conversation at a time.